This homeless girl jumps in front of a luxury car and hands a baby to a millionaire, saying he has 48 hours to live. But will the baby survive the rare disease and surgery he needs? 2 days later, this happens. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to my channel to support my work. The rain lashed against the streets of Chicago that winter night. Richard straightened his tie as he left the gala, where he had just closed another multi-million-dollar deal. At 45, he was known for his ruthlessness in business and his ability to turn failing companies into profitable empires. What no one knew was that behind that successful facade was a lonely man who returned every night to an empty mansion in the Gold Coast. As he walked to his imported car, shielded by an umbrella held by the valet, Richard thought about how his life had become all about numbers, meetings, and empty social events. He had no close family, had never married, and his last vacation was over 5 years ago. The sound of the rain against the asphalt was deafening, blending with the noise of the cars passing by Michigan Avenue. That's when something happened, something that would change his life forever. A girl darted out of the dark alley next to the restaurant. Her bare feet slapped against the puddles, and her soaked clothes clung to her thin, fragile body. In her arms, she carried a bundle she desperately protected from the rain. Before Richard could react, she threw herself in front of his car, hitting the windshield hard. "Please, sir, please! He only has 48 hours to live!" the girl cried, her voice choked with sobs mixing with the sound of the storm. Richard froze. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Her face was dirty, marked by tears that mingled with the rain. In her arms, a small, pale baby barely moved, protected only by a thin, damp blanket. The valet tried to pull the girl away, but she clung to the car door even tighter. "I beg you, sir, he's going to die. Please help me." Her large, dark eyes overflowed with a desperation Richard had never witnessed. Something stirred within him. Maybe it was the vulnerability of that child. Maybe it was fate playing a trick on his meticulously organized life. Without thinking, twice he opened the car door. "Get in," he said, surprising himself with the decision. The girl didn't hesitate. She quickly got into the back seat, still holding the baby tightly to her chest. Richard got into the car and turned on the heater, watching the 2 soaking children in his Italian leather seats through the rearview mirror. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm as he drove without a destination in mind. "Isadora," she replied, still trembling. "And this is Lucas. Is Lucas your brother?" Isadora hesitated for a moment, her eyes dropping to the baby in her arms. "No. He was left at my grandma's by a neighbor. She said she was going to a party and never came back." Richard sensed something strange in her tone, a hesitation that didn't match the desperation of moments before. "And where is your grandmother now?" "She died," Isadora replied, her voice breaking. "A few weeks ago. I was left alone with Lucas, but he's getting weaker and weaker. I tried to ask for help, but nobody wanted to listen." The baby let out a faint whimper, and Richard could see in the rear-view mirror how pale, almost bluish, his skin was. Without a second thought, he turned the car toward the nearest hospital. "Why did you choose to ask me for help?" he asked, still trying to understand the situation. "I saw your car, your clothes. I thought maybe you could help," Isadora replied, but something in her voice sounded rehearsed, as if she were hiding something bigger. Arriving at the hospital, Richard used all his influence to ensure immediate attention. The doctors quickly took Lucas to the emergency room, leaving Isadora soaking wet and trembling in the hallway. Richard took off his suit jacket and covered the girl's shoulders, noticing how small and thin she was. The diagnosis came as a shock. Lucas was born with a rare heart condition and needed urgent surgery. The procedure was complex and extraordinarily expensive. "Do whatever it takes," Richard told the doctor, handing over his credit card without hesitation. "Spare no expense." While the doctors prepared Lucas for surgery, Richard turned to talk to Isadora, but the girl had disappeared. He searched the entire hospital, asked nurses and security guards, but no one had seen where she had gone. Looking out the hospital window, Richard watched the rain continue to fall. Something about this story didn't add up. Why would a girl be wandering around the city alone with a sick baby? Why had she run away as soon as Lucas started receiving care? And why couldn't Richard stop thinking that there was something much bigger behind this seemingly simple story? The night would be long, and this was just the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. What Richard didn't know was that fate had chosen this rainy night to teach him the greatest lesson of his life, one that no MBA or management, a course could have provided. The hours dragged on at the hospital as Richard awaited news of Lucas's surgery. Isadora's disappearance deeply troubled him. Why would a girl who had shown so much desperation to save the baby simply disappear the moment he began to receive help? Sitting in the waiting room, he mentally replayed every detail of their conversation in the car. The story of the neighbor who abandoned the baby sounded increasingly inconsistent. Richard began to question every word Isadora had said. The way she held Lucas, the familiarity with which she cradled him, the genuine desperation in her eyes, all indicated a much deeper connection than she had admitted. A nurse approached, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Mendes, the doctor wants to speak with you." Richard followed her to a small room, where Dr. Ricardo awaited him with a grave expression. "The surgery was successful, but the situation is more complex than we imagined," the doctor said, adjusting his glasses. "The baby shows signs of severe malnutrition and lack of basic care. Under normal circumstances, a child with this heart condition would have been diagnosed and treated shortly after birth." "How is that possible? Didn't he have any medical follow-up?" "Apparently not, and there's more. We found marks that indicate he may have been born at home without professional assistance. We need to make a notification to the relevant authorities." The news hit Richard like a punch to the gut. The image of Isadora, so small and fragile, carrying that burden alone, became even more painful. What had happened for a baby to be born and live his first months in such conditions? Determined to find answers, Richard hired Regina, a private investigator recommended by his lawyer. "I need you to find Isadora," he said, handing over a detailed description of the girl. "There's something very wrong with this story, and that child may be in danger." In the days that followed, Richard divided his time between the hospital and his company. Lucas slowly recovered, gaining color and strength with each passing day. The nurses commented on how he was a fighter, overcoming every obstacle with surprising resilience for such a small baby. It was on a rainy afternoon, similar to the one in which it all began, that Regina called with her first findings. Her voice conveyed an urgency that made Richard feel a pang in his chest. "I found some information about the girl, but it's not what we expected," Regina said. "The grandmother's story is completely false. In fact, Isadora lived with her mother in an extremely deprived area of the city. Her name is Helena Santos, 28 years old, a widow." Richard sat down, feeling the weight of that revelation. "And what else did you find?" "Her husband, John Santos, died about a year ago in a car accident. He was an alcoholic and, according to neighbors, extremely violent. After he died, Helena lost everything. She worked as a cleaning lady but stopped, showing up a few months ago. No one knows for sure where she is now." "And Lucas, did you find anything about him?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Mendes, Lucas is Helena's son, Isadora's brother. The girl lied about the neighbor's story. The world seemed to spin around Richard. Isadora's lie now made sense. She was trying to protect her brother, fearing that revealing the truth might prevent him from receiving help. "There's one more thing," Regina continued, her voice now lower. "I found records of several attempts by Helena to seek medical help for Lucas. She went to public hospitals, clinics, but always received the same answer. The surgery he needed was too complex and expensive. There was no forecast of when it could be performed by the public system." Richard felt a wave of nausea. How many times had that mother begged for help, watching her baby waste away each day? What desperation led her to allow her 10-year-old daughter to go out alone in the city in search of a miracle? "I need you to keep looking," Richard said, his voice trembling slightly. "They have to be somewhere, and from what you've told me, the situation may be even worse than we imagined." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stayed at the hospital, watching Lucas sleep in his crib in the neonatal ICU. The baby looked so small and fragile among the tubes and monitors. How his own mother must be suffering, not knowing if her son was alive or dead. The next morning, Regina called again. Her voice was different, as if she was hesitant to share what she had discovered. "Mr. Mendez, I found Helena and Isadora," she said finally, "but the situation is much worse than we imagined." Richard felt his heart race. "Where are they?" "In an abandoned building, sir. They're living in inhumane conditions. Helena is very sick. She can barely move. Isadora has been going out to look for food in dumpsters. They have nothing, absolutely nothing." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked again at Lucas, now sleeping peacefully, receiving all the care that money could buy. A few miles away, his mother and sister were struggling to survive another day. "Give me the address," he said, already grabbing his keys. "I'm going there now." "Mr. Mendez, wait." Regina's voice stopped him. "There's something you need to know before. Something that will make all this even more complicated." Richard stopped, feeling that what he was about to hear would completely change the course of that story. What else had that family faced? What other secrets were hidden behind the desperation of a girl on a rainy night? Regina hesitated before continuing, her voice trembling slightly on the phone. "Helena is dying, Mr. Mendez. She has an advanced, untreated tumor. That's why she lost her jobs as a cleaning lady. She could no longer clean the houses. When Lucas was born with the heart problem, she was already too sick to seek proper help." Richard needed to sit down, feeling the weight of that revelation. Now he understood why Isadora had acted with such desperation. It wasn't just Lucas's life that was at risk. She was about to lose her entire family. "I'll send you the address," Regina continued, "but be prepared. The place is rough." Half an hour later, Richard parked his car in front of an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The contrast between the luxury vehicle and the scene of misery around him couldn't be greater. The peeling walls and broken windows told stories of abandonment and neglect. Following Regina's instructions, he went up to the third floor. The smell of mold and dampness was suffocating. At the end of the dark hallway, a door improvised with pieces of wood marked the home where Helena and Isadora survived. Before he could knock, he heard a deep, painful cough coming from inside. His heart ached as the door slowly opened, revealing Isadora. The girl paled upon recognizing him. How did you find us?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "That doesn't matter now," Richard replied softly. "Can I come in? I need to talk to your mother." Isadora hesitated, looking back as if seeking permission. A weak voice answered from inside the room, "Let him in, daughter." What Richard saw upon entering would never leave his memory. On an old mattress on the floor, covered by a few rags, was Helena. Her face was so thin that the bones seemed to want to tear through her pale skin. The eyes, deep and dark, were identical to Isadora's, but carried a weariness that went beyond the physical. "So you're the man who saved my son," Helena said, trying to sit up with difficulty. "Isadora told me everything." Richard looked around. The apartment was just an empty room. Some old clothes were folded in a corner along with a few kitchen utensils. A half-melted candle was the only source of light besides the brightness that came through the window without glass. "Why didn't you look for me?" he asked, feeling his voice fail. "Why did you let Isadora go out alone that night?" Helena closed, her eyes a solitary tear running down her marked face. "I tried, sir, God knows how I tried. I went to every hospital I could. I begged for help, but who will pay attention to a sick and poor woman? When Lucas started to get worse, I could barely get out of bed." She paused to cough, her fragile body shaking with the effort. Isadora rushed to help her, offering water in a cracked glass. "One night," Helena continued after recovering, "I heard Lucas crying. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. Isadora came to help me and saw that her brother was turning blue. That's when she decided she needed to do something. Mom didn't want to let me." Isadora interrupted, her voice choked. "But I said I was going to find someone who could help. I spent days watching people leaving fancy restaurants looking for someone who seemed good. And you chose me," Richard said, feeling a lump in his throat. "You were alone," Isadora replied. "And you had a sad look, even wearing such nice clothes. I thought maybe you'd understand." Helena tried to move again, but a wave of pain made her moan. Richard noticed bloodstains on the rag she was using as a sheet. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Months ago," Helena replied, her voice growing weaker. "When they discovered the tumor, it was already too late. They said I would need surgery, chemotherapy. How could I pay for that? I could barely buy food for my children." Richard felt a wave of anger rise within him. How could a mother be forced to choose between her own life and the survival of her children? How had a 10-year-old child needed to become the only hope for her family? "Lucas is fine," he said, trying to bring some comfort. "The surgery was a success. He is recovering." Helena sobbed with relief, more tears running down her face. "Thank God. I prayed every night asking that my son would find help even if I couldn't be with him." "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" It was Isadora who answered, her voice small but firm. "We were afraid. Afraid that if they knew we were too poor to even have a place to live, no one would want to help Lucas. Afraid they would separate us. Afraid that—" She didn't complete the sentence, but she didn't need to. The fear was etched in every corner of that place, in every improvised object, in every mark of suffering on Helena's face. "Sir," Helena said, gathering strength to sit up, "I know I have no right to ask for anything more, but take care of my son. Isadora is strong, she will survive, but Lucas, he is still so small." "Don't talk like that, Mom," Isadora protested, hugging Helena. "You're going to get better, you have to." Richard watched that scene, feeling his heart break. A girl who had to grow up too fast, a mother forced to give up everything for her children, a baby who barely had a chance to live. All that pain, all that suffering, and why? Because the world had turned its back on them. At that moment, something changed within him. All his achievements, all his money and power seemed empty in the face of the love and courage of that family. He knew he couldn't simply walk away and leave them in that situation, but he also knew that what he was about to discover would make everything even more complex and painful. "I'm going to help you," he said finally. "All of you. But first, you need to tell me everything. Absolutely everything." Helena and Isadora exchanged a look, and Richard realized that there was more, much more behind that story. What else were they hiding? What other pains did they carry? The answer would come, but he wasn't prepared for the impact it would have on his life. Helena took a deep breath, gathering strength to tell what she had kept for so long. Her voice came out weak, interrupted by coughing, but loaded with a pain that went far beyond the disease that consumed her body. "I met John, my husband, when I was very young," she began. "In the beginning, he was a good man, hard-working. We had a simple but dignified life. He worked as a bus driver. I did cleaning jobs. When Isadora was born, it was the happiest day of our lives." She paused, a shadow crossing her face as she continued. But then John started drinking. First, it was just a few drinks after work. Soon it became an addiction that consumed everything: our money, our peace, our family. Isadora, sitting on the floor next to her mother, hugged her knees as if she wanted to protect herself from the memories that those words brought. "He lost his job," Helena continued. "He started borrowing money. When he could no longer pay the debts, he took out his frustration on us. I endured everything to protect Isadora, but there were nights when..." Her voice failed, and Richard realized that some wounds were too deep to be put into words. "It was on one of those nights that I discovered I was pregnant with Lucas," Helena resumed after a moment. "John was out of his mind. He said we couldn't have another child, that we barely had anything to eat. He wanted me to have an abortion." Silent tears streamed down Helena's face as she continued. "I refused. I said it was my son, that I was going to have my baby even if I had to raise him alone. It was the first time I faced John directly. It was also the last." Richard felt a chill down his spine, predicting what would come next. "He pushed me. I fell down the stairs of our shack." Helena closed her eyes, reliving that moment. "I was unconscious in the hospital for 2 days. When I woke up, the doctors said it was a miracle that both I and the baby had survived, but they also discovered something else during the exams: the tumor." Isadora sobbed softly, and Richard realized that the girl had probably never heard that part of the story. "John died a few weeks later," Helena continued. "He drank too much, got in the car anyway. He hit a pole. Many people said it was divine punishment, but I could only think about what would become of my children." She paused to cough again, and Richard offered her water. Her hands trembled as she held the glass. "The debts that John left behind consumed us. We lost the house, everything we had. I still tried to work, even with the pregnancy and the illness. But every day it got harder. When Lucas was born, we didn't even have enough to eat properly." Richard looked around again, noticing details he hadn't noticed before. An old school notebook where Isadora still tried to study. A rag doll, the only reminder of better times. A faded photo pinned on the wall, Helena younger, smiling, holding a baby Isadora. "I realized something was wrong with Lucas since he was born," Helena continued. "His skin would turn blue sometimes. He had trouble nursing. I went to every hospital I could. I begged for help. But without money, without insurance, we were just another number in an endless line." "Why didn't you seek social assistance?" Richard asked. Helena let out a bitter laugh, which soon turned into more coughing. "You think I didn't try? But to get any assistance, you need documents, proof of residence, time to wait in lines. We had none of that. And every day that passed, I saw my children wasting away." "When Mom got too sick to work," Isadora interjected, speaking for the first time since the story began, "I tried to help. I collected cans, asked for food in restaurants. Sometimes I managed to make a few bucks helping at the farmer's market." Richard felt his heart clench as he imagined that little girl carrying such a big burden. "But then Lucas started to get worse," Helena continued, her voice growing weaker. "He had increasingly severe seizures. On a particularly bad night, I Thought I would lose him. That's when Isadora said she had a plan. I had been watching people for days, Isadora explained. I saw how they left the expensive restaurants, throwing away more food than we ate in a week. I thought that if I could get someone to really look at us, maybe. And you chose that night to approach you, Helena completed. My 10-year-old daughter had to do what I, as a mother, couldn't: save her brother. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with all the pains and injustices of that story. Richard tried to process everything he had heard, feeling a mixture of compassion and outrage growing within him. But there was something in Helena's gaze, a shadow that suggested there was still more, something she hesitated to reveal, as if she feared that this last truth could change everything. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," Helena said. Finally, her voice almost a whisper. "Something about Lucas, something that even Isadora doesn't know." Richard felt his heart race. What else had that family faced? What secret could be so heavy that a mother had kept it even from her oldest daughter? Helena took a deep breath, gathering her last strength. What she was about to reveal would change not only the fate of her family, but also Richard's life, in a way that no one could have predicted. Helena closed her eyes for a moment, as if seeking courage in the last strength she had left. When she opened them again, there was a painful determination in her gaze. "Lucas is not John's son," she said finally, her voice trembling. "In fact, he is the son of someone you know very well." Richard felt the air escape his lungs. Isadora, who was sitting on the floor, stood up abruptly, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you talking about, Mom?" the girl asked, her voice choked. Helena stretched out her trembling hand to her daughter, pulling her close. "Forgive me for never telling you, my daughter, but I needed to protect you. Protect Lucas." "Who is Lucas's father?" Richard asked, feeling a strange premonition growing in his chest. "Anthony Mendes," Helena replied, and the name fell like a bomb in the small room. "Your father." Richard staggered back, needing to lean against the wall. His father had passed away only 6 months ago, leaving behind a business, empire, and a complicated legacy of secrets and resentments. How is that possible?" he managed to ask, his voice unrecognizable. Helena took a deep breath, preparing to reveal a story she had kept hidden for so long. "I used to work in your family's house, almost 2 years ago. I was one of the housekeepers. Your father, he was always kind to me, asked about Isadora, worried when he noticed I was having problems at home." She paused, coughing violently. Isadora ran to get water, her hands trembling as she offered the glass. "John was at rock bottom at the time," Helena continued after recovering. "He drank more and more, had lost another job. Anthony noticed the bruises I tried to hide, heard me when I cried secretly while cleaning the house." Richard vaguely remembered seeing Helena in the hallways of the mansion where he grew up, always discreet, always hard-working, but he was too busy with his own life, his ambitions, to notice the drama that unfolded right under his nose. "One night," Helena continued, her voice now almost a whisper, "I stayed later finishing a job. John had drunk a lot. I was afraid to go home. Your father found me crying in the laundry room." She closed her eyes, the memories clearly painful. "Anthony comforted me, offered me help. He said he could help me get out of that situation, that I deserved a better life. One thing led to another, and you had an affair," Richard completed, feeling the weight of the realization. "It wasn't an affair," Helena corrected. "It was one night, a single night of comfort amidst so much suffering. But it was enough." Isadora was in shock, processing the revelation that her little brother, whom she had fought so hard to protect, was actually her half-brother. "When I found out I was pregnant," Helena continued, "I didn't tell anyone. John was so out of it at the time that he didn't even realize that the timelines didn't match. And Anthony, he had his family, his reputation. I couldn't destroy all that." But did he know? Richard asked, his voice hoarse. Helena shook her head. I never told him. A few weeks later, I was fired. The head housekeeper said there were staff cuts, but I always suspected that your mother had found out something. I never got in touch with Anthony again. Richard staggered to the window, needing air. His father, always so correct, so concerned with appearances, had a son that no one knew about. A son who almost died in misery while he lived in his mansion, oblivious to everything. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, turning back to Helena. Because I'm dying, she replied simply, and because Lucas deserves to know his origin, not to ask for anything, not to cause a scandal, but because every person deserves to know who they are. Tears now ran freely down Isadora's face. That's why you seem so familiar, she said softly. You have the same eyes as Lucas. Richard sat down, feeling the weight of all those revelations. Lucas wasn't just a baby that fate had put in his path. He was his brother, his blood, a child who almost lost his life for lack of resources, while his family swam in money. There's one more thing you need to know, Helena said, her voice failing. About the tumor. But before she could continue, a violent coughing fit overcame her. This time the blood that stained the cloth she brought to her mouth was much more than the previous times. "Mom!" Isadora cried, running to support her. Richard also approached quickly, realizing that the situation was serious. Helena could barely breathe, her fragile body shaking with the effort. "We need to take her to the hospital now," he said, already preparing to carry her. "No," Helena managed to say between gasps. I need to finish. There's something you need to know." But her strength was fading quickly. The secret she still kept, the one that seemed to weigh so heavily on her conscience, threatened to go with her to the grave. Richard looked at Isadora, saw the terror in her young eyes, and knew he had to act. But what he was about to discover would change not only the fate of that family, but also everything he thought he knew about his own father and about himself. Richard didn't hesitate any longer. Ignoring Helena's weak protests, he took her in his arms. She was so light that she looked like a child, her body consumed by the disease weighing less than many of the briefcases he carried to meetings. Isadora ran ahead, clearing the way as they descended the precarious stairs of the abandoned building. In the car, Helena continued to cough, each spasm seeming to suck more of her life force. Isadora held her hand in the back seat, silent tears streaming down her young face. Richard drove as fast as he could, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Hang in there," he murmured, more to himself than to Helena. "We're almost there." Arriving at the same hospital where Lucas was admitted, Richard used all his influence to ensure immediate attention. The doctors rushed Helena to the emergency room, leaving Richard and Isadora in the waiting room, a heavy silence between them. "She's going to be okay, isn't she?" Isadora asked, her voice small and frightened. At that moment, all the strength she had shown in recent weeks seemed to have dissipated, leaving only a 10-year-old girl terrified of the possibility of losing her mother. Richard couldn't answer. How could he promise something he wasn't sure of? How could he lie to that child who had already faced too many lies? The hours dragged on. Richard took the opportunity to check on Lucas in the neonatal ICU. The baby slept serenely, oblivious to the drama unfolding a few floors below. Looking at him now, Richard could see the similarities. The same traits of the father he had inherited, the same curve of the nose, the same shape of the eyes. How could his father let this happen? How could he live his last months knowing he had another son, a child who desperately needed help? When he returned to the waiting room, he found Isadora curled up in a chair, finally overcome by exhaustion. He covered her with his suit jacket and sat beside her, preparing for a long, Wait, it was almost dawn when the doctor finally appeared. His grave expression said it all, even before he opened his mouth. The situation is very serious, he explained. The tumor is in its terminal stage, affecting several organs. It's a miracle she has resisted so long without treatment. How long? Richard asked, feeling a lump in his throat. Days. Maybe hours, the doctor replied, his voice softening as he looked at Isadora, who was still asleep. We did everything we could to stabilize her and control the pain, but can I see her? The doctor nodded. She's asking for you, but I need to warn you, she's very weak. Every word is a huge effort. Richard woke Isadora gently, trying to prepare her for what they would see. The girl, however, seemed to have aged years in that night of waiting. Her eyes, when they opened, no longer had the fear of before, just a sad acceptance. In the room, Helena was connected to several machines, tubes and wires attached to her fragile body. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes opened when she heard the approaching footsteps. "My children," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. Isadora ran to hug her, taking care with the equipment. Richard stood at the door, feeling like an intruder in that intimate moment. "Come," Helena called, extending her trembling hand to him. I need to finish telling." "Mom, don't push yourself," Isadora pleaded, holding her other hand. "No, daughter, you need to know," Helena insisted, gathering her last strength. "About the tumor, about your father, Richard." She paused, breathing with difficulty. Richard approached, holding her outstretched hand. "Anthony knew," she said finally, "about the tumor, about Lucas." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "How?" "I managed to talk to him a few months ago," Helena continued, each word a visible effort. "When I found out I was dying, I went to the company, I showed him the exams, I told him about Lucas." Tears began to stream down Helena's face. "He promised to help, said he would take responsibility. But then he died." Richard completed, feeling a wave of anger rise within him. His father had known everything and even so did nothing. "No," Helena corrected, her voice even weaker. "He tried, but your mother—" Richard froze. "My mother? What about her?" "She found out, saw us talking. She threatened, said that if Anthony did anything, she would destroy everything, expose his other secrets." "What secrets?" Richard asked, but Helena was having trouble continuing. "Your father wasn't the man you thought he was," she managed to say between gasps. "There were other children." The revelation hit Richard like lightning. His father, the great Anthony Mendes, an example of morality and good manners, had other children scattered around. How many siblings did he still not know? "That's why your mother had so much power over him," Helena continued, her voice now just a whisper. "She knew everything, kept all the secrets, in exchange for maintaining the image, the reputation." Isadora sobbed softly, squeezing her mother's hand. Richard felt his head spin with all those revelations. "But there's more," Helena said, her eyes now focused intently on Richard. "About the money, the empire your father built." Before she could continue, however, the machines began to beep frantically. Helena arched in bed, her body being seized by convulsions. "Mom!" Isadora screamed in panic. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, pushing Richard and Isadora out. The last vision they had was of Helena, her hand still outstretched towards them, as if begging to complete her confession. In the hallway, Richard held Isadora, who was crying desperately, while his mind tried to process everything he had discovered. What secrets had his father taken to the grave? What kind of empire was this, built on lies and threats? And more importantly, what was his mother still hiding? The doctors fought for almost an hour to stabilize Helena. When they finally succeeded, she was even weaker, connected to even more machines, her breathing maintained only by devices. The doctor was clear. She had gone into a coma, and the chances of recovery were practically nil. Richard watched Isadora sitting next to her mother's bed, holding her inert hand, whispering words of love and supplication. The girl refused to leave, as if her constant presence could prevent life from escaping Helena's fragile body. While the hours passed in that silent vigil, Richard's mind seethed with Helena's revelations, other children, other secrets, an empire built on lies. His mother, Beatriz Mendez, always so elegant and controlled, guarding all those secrets like weapons. He decided he needed answers. He couldn't wait any longer. "Isadora," he called softly. "I need to take care of some things. I promise I'll be back soon. The nurse will stay here with you, and if anything happens, she'll call me immediately." The girl just nodded, without taking her eyes off her mother's pale face. Richard drove to the mansion where his mother still lived, the same house where Helena had worked, where this whole story had begun. The place never seemed so oppressive to him, with its imposing columns and perfectly maintained gardens. Beatrice was in her sunroom, as she always did on Sunday afternoons, taking tea in her fine English china. Seeing her son entering with a stormy expression, she only raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Richard, what a surprise! I thought you were busy with that project at the hospital." The casual tone of her voice, as if she didn't know exactly what was happening, made Richard's blood boil. "You knew," he said, his voice trembling with contained anger. "You knew about Lucas, about Helena, about everything." Beatrice gently placed her teacup down, a small smile appearing on her painted lips. "So she finally told you," she replied, without denying it. "I figured it would happen sooner or later." "How could you?" Richard exploded. "How could you let a child, my brother, almost die while we swam in money?" "Sit down, Richard," Beatrice ordered, her voice taking on an icy tone. "If you want to know the truth, you're going to need to control yourself." Something in the way she said that made Richard obey, sinking into one of the leather armchairs. "Your father," Beatrice began, pouring herself more tea with precise movements, "wasn't the man you thought you knew. The empire he built, which you now manage so proudly, didn't come just from hard work and good business decisions." She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "Anthony had a pattern. Beautiful women, usually employees, always in a vulnerable situation. Helena wasn't the first, nor would she be the last, but she was the only one who came so close to destroying everything we built." "What are you talking about?" "She found out things, Richard, things that no one should know, documents, conversations she overheard while cleaning the office. Your father wasn't as careful as he should have been." Richard felt a chill down his spine. "What kind of things?" "Your father built this empire by making deals with dangerous people, money laundering, bribes, fraudulent contracts. The list is long, and Helena, she knew too much. That's why you fired her." Beatrice laughed, a joyless sound. "Fired? I protected her, Richard. There were people who wanted her to disappear permanently. I convinced your father that it was better to keep her alive, but away." Richard felt nauseous, realizing the implications of what his mother was saying. "When she came back months ago, begging for help for the baby, your father faltered. Remorse finally caught up with him. He wanted to take on Lucas, help Helena, but I couldn't allow it." "Because you knew that would expose all the secrets?" Before she could continue, however, the machines began to beep frantically. Helena arched in bed, her body being seized by convulsions. "Mom!" Isadora screamed in panic. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, pushing Richard and Isadora out. The last vision they had was of Helena, her hand still outstretched towards them, as if begging to complete her confession. In the hallway, Richard held Isadora, who was crying desperately, while his mind tried to process everything he had discovered. What secrets had his father taken to the grave? What kind of empire was this, built on lies and threats? And more importantly, what was his mother still hiding? The doctors fought for almost an hour to stabilize Helena. When they finally succeeded, she was even weaker, connected to even more machines, her breathing maintained only by devices. The doctor was clear. She had gone into a coma, and the chances of recovery were practically nil. Richard watched Isadora, sitting next to her mother's bed, holding her inert hand, whispering words of love and supplication. The girl refused to leave, as if her constant presence could prevent life from escaping Helena's fragile body. While the hours passed in that silent vigil, Richard's mind seethed with Helena's revelations, other children, other secrets, an empire built on lies. His mother, Beatriz Mendez, always so elegant and controlled, guarding all those secrets like weapons. He decided he needed answers. He couldn't wait any longer. "Isadora," he called softly, "I need to take care of some things. I promise I'll be back soon. The nurse will stay here with you, and if anything happens, she'll call me immediately." The girl just nodded, without taking her eyes off her mother's pale face. Richard drove to the hospital like a madman, his mind divided between his mother's revelations and the fear of what he would find when he got there. The nurse's words echoed in his head. Something wrong with Helena, something wrong with the baby. How much more suffering would that family have to endure? Arriving at the hospital, he found a scene that chilled his blood. Doctors and nurses were running in and out of Helena's room, while Isadora was curled up in a corner of the hallway, hugged by a nurse, sobbing uncontrollably. "What happened?" he asked, his heart beating erratically. "Her blood pressure dropped drastically," explained the nurse who had called him. "We're doing everything we can, but—" A high-pitched, continuous sound cut through the air, coming from the room. The sound no one wants to hear in a hospital, a flatline on the heart monitor. "No, no, no!" Isadora screamed, trying to run to the room. Richard held her back, both watching helplessly as the medical team tried to revive Helena. "Time of death, 5:45 p.m., the doctor announced after long minutes of frustrated attempts. Isadora collapsed into Richard's arms, her small body shaking. With heart-wrenching sobs, he hugged her tightly, feeling his own tears streaming down. Helena had departed, taking with her secrets that now seemed even heavier. But there was no time even to process that loss. A nurse from the neonatal ICU came running down the hallway. "Mr. Mendez! The baby! Lucas is having a crisis!" Richard felt like the floor was disappearing beneath his feet. He couldn't lose them both on the same day. He couldn't let another life be lost because of his family's secrets. "Stay with her?" he asked the nurse who was holding Isadora, and ran to the ICU. Lucas was turning blue, thrashing in his crib as the doctors tried to stabilize him. His little heart, already weakened by the congenital condition, seemed unable to withstand the fight any longer. "What's happening?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "The surgery we did. It seems there was a complication," the doctor explained. "Between procedures, we need to operate again, immediately." "Do whatever it takes," Richard replied. "No matter the cost, no matter anything. Save my brother." The word came out naturally for the first time. Yes, Lucas was his brother, and he would not allow another life to be destroyed by his father's sins. While Lucas was rushed to surgery, Richard returned to Isadora. The girl was calmer now, but her eyes had an emptiness that hurt to see. "Lucas," she began, her voice hoarse. "They're taking care of him," Richard replied, sitting down beside her. "He's going to be okay. He has to be." The next hours were a blur of agonizing waiting, cold coffee, and silent prayers. Richard tried to be strong for Isadora, but inside he was shattered. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? That's when his cell phone rang again. It was Beatrice. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice still maintaining that controlled tone that now irritated Richard deeply. "I'm sorry for her death." "Are you really?" he replied bitterly. "Or are you relieved that she took the secrets to the grave?" "Don't be childish, Richard. I'm calling to say we need to resolve the situation with the girl." "What situation?" "Well, she can't stay with you. That would raise too many questions. I've already arranged for an institution." "No!" Richard's voice came out louder than intended, making Isadora jump beside him. "You're not going to touch her. You're not going to separate these siblings. You're not going to destroy any more families." "Be reasonable," Beatrice insisted. "Think of the scandal. Think of the consequences." "The only consequences I care about now are the lives of these children," Richard cut in. "And there's more. I want to know who my other brother is, the one who works with me." There was silence on the other end of the line when Beatrice spoke. Again, her voice had a tone Richard had never heard before, fear. "Don't mess with that, Richard. There are things that are better left unknown." "Enough secrets," he exploded. "Enough lies. I'm going to find out everything, and I'm going to fix Dad's mistakes, even if it means destroying the entire empire he built." "If you do that," Beatrice's voice was now icy, "it won't just be our family that suffers the consequences. There are powerful people involved, Richard. People who wouldn't hesitate to kill," he completed, "like they wanted to kill Helena. Well, let them come. I'm not backing down." He hung up the phone, trembling with anger. Beside him, Isadora looked at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked in a low voice. Richard hugged her tightly. "You're going to stay with me and Lucas. We're a family now, and I'm going to protect you no matter what it costs." At that moment, the doctor appeared in the hallway. His expression was grave. "Mr. Mendez, something happened during the surgery, something that will change everything we thought we knew about Lucas's condition." Richard felt his heart clench. What other ordeal awaited them? What other secrets were still to come? The doctor guided Richard and Isadora to a small conference room, away from the bustle of the hallway. The tension was palpable as he arranged some X-rays and exams on the table. "During the surgery," he began, "we discovered something unusual in Lucas's heart. His condition isn't exactly what we initially thought." Richard held Isadora's hand tightly. "What do you mean?" "Lucas's heart problem is hereditary," the doctor explained. "And, curiously, it's exactly the same problem that your father had, Mr. Mendez." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "My father had a heart problem?" "Yes, we found his medical records in our system. Anthony Mendez was operated on in this same hospital 30 years ago, when he was about Lucas's age. It's an extremely rare condition that affects only people with a specific genetic mutation." Isadora looked from one to the other, trying to understand. "Is that bad?" The doctor smiled for the first time. "Actually, it's surprisingly good news, because we know exactly how to treat it. The surgery we performed on your father was successful, and he lived decades without any complication. With Lucas, we can follow the same protocol." Richard let out a sigh of relief, but something still bothered him. "Why did my father never tell me about this?" "Maybe because he didn't want you to know he had a condition that could be passed on to your children," the doctor suggested. "The records show that he had regular checkups, monitoring whether you or his other children had developed the problem." "Other children?" Richard's voice failed. "Do you know who they are?" The doctor seemed to realize he had said too much. "I'm sorry, but that would be a breach of medical confidentiality. What I can say is that there are 3 more patient records with the same genetic condition, all related to your father." 3. Richard had 3 more siblings besides Lucas, and his father knew all of them, monitored their health in secret, but never had the courage to publicly acknowledge them. "Is Lucas okay now?" Isadora asked, bringing the conversation back to what really mattered. Yes, the doctor replied. The surgery was successful. He's strong, like his father was. With proper care, he will have a completely normal life. When they left the room, Richard was determined. Not only would he take care of Lucas and Isadora, but he would also find his other siblings. They deserved to know the truth. They deserved a chance to be a family. Back in the room where Helena's body still lay, Richard noticed that Isadora was holding something in her hands, a small rosary that her mother always carried. She prayed every night, the girl said, tears returning to her eyes. She asked God to take care of us when she was gone. Richard hugged the girl, letting her cry on his shoulder. Your mother was an extraordinary woman, Isadora. She protected you until the end, even when everything was against her. It was then that he noticed something strange about the rosary. There was a small compartment in the cross, almost imperceptible. Inside it, they found a piece of paper folded several times. It was a letter, written in Helena's trembling handwriting. My beloved children, if you are reading this, it's because I didn't make it to tell you the whole truth. But I couldn't leave without leaving this last record. Anthony wasn't a bad man. He was weak, yes. He let himself be corrupted by power and money, but in the end, he tried to do the right thing. The last time we spoke, he told me about his other children, and about how his wife Beatrice used that secret to control him. But there's something more important that you need to know. Anthony discovered something serious weeks before he died. Documents that proved that Beatrice, along with other executives of the company, had been embezzling money for years. Millions that were supposed to go to hospitals and social programs, but ended up in secret accounts abroad. He planned to report everything, clear the company's name, acknowledge all his children. That's why he died so suddenly. A heart attack, they said, but in reality, the letter ended there, probably interrupted when Helena got worse, but it was enough. Richard now understood why his mother was so desperate to keep the secrets buried. My God, he whispered, my own mother, she... He couldn't complete the sentence. The implication was too heavy, too terrible. At that moment, his cell phone rang again. It was an unknown number. The voice on the other end was familiar, although he couldn't immediately identify it. Richard? This is Ricardo from the finance department. I know it's not a good time, but we need to talk. About your father. About who I really am. Richard felt his heart race. Ricardo, the discreet financial director who had worked at the company for decades. Could he be one of his brothers? And there's more, Ricardo continued, his voice trembling. I found some documents in the old safe, documents that your mother doesn't know exist. I think I know what really happened to your father. The truth was finally emerging, but was Richard prepared for what he would discover? Was any of them? Richard met Ricardo at a discreet coffee shop, away from the prying eyes of the company. The middle-aged man, always so controlled and professional, now seemed nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he held an old briefcase. Your father told me the truth a month before he died, Ricardo began, his voice low. He said it was time to right his wrongs, to bring all his children together. There were 4 of us besides you, me, Lucas, and the twins Maria and John, who work at our branch upstate. Richard absorbed the information in silence. Twins, 2 more siblings he never knew. Why are you telling me this now? Ricardo opened the briefcase, revealing a series of documents. Because your father didn't die of a heart attack. He was poisoned. The revelation hit Richard like lightning. How do you know that? Your father suspected that something like this might happen. He had been gathering evidence for months. Documents, recordings, records of bank transfers. Everything that proved the embezzlement scheme run by your mother. Why didn't he report it? He was going to report it. He had scheduled a meeting with the district attorney for the following week, but the night before, Ricardo swallowed hard. Beatrice found out, and then the heart attack happened. Richard felt nauseous, thinking that his own mother would be capable of something so terrible. How did you survive all these years, working so close to her, knowing this? Because your father made me promise that I would protect the evidence until the right moment came. And now, with everything that happened to Helena and Lucas, I know that moment has arrived. At that instant, Richard's cell phone rang. It was from the hospital. Lucas had woken up from surgery and was responding well, a small glimmer of hope amid so much darkness. "What do we do now?" Richard asked, putting away the documents. "There's one more thing you need to know," Ricardo said, "about the embezzled money. It wasn't just greed. Your mother had been blackmailing powerful people for years, using information that your father had gathered. The money was the payment for her silence." Richard began to understand the scope of everything. That's why she was so desperate to keep all the secrets buried. Yes, but now... Ricardo smiled for the first time. Now we have everything. We need to put an end to it. In the weeks that followed, Richard worked tirelessly with Ricardo and a team of trusted lawyers. They gathered all the evidence, documented every penny embezzled, every threat made. When he finally confronted Beatrice, it wasn't with anger or a thirst for revenge. It was with a deep sadness and an unwavering determination. "It's over, Mom," he said, placing the documents on the table in her house. "I know everything. About Dad, about the money, about my siblings." Beatrice showed no surprise, only weariness. "What are you going to do? Report me? Destroy your own mother?" "No," Richard replied. "I'm going to do what Dad wanted to do, make things right. All the embezzled money will be returned, the company will be restructured, cleaned up, and my siblings will be acknowledged as they should have been from the beginning. And me? You have two choices. You can collaborate, voluntarily return everything you took, step away from the company, and maintain your freedom. Or you can resist and face the legal consequences." To his surprise, Beatrice laughed, a sad, empty laugh. "Do you know why I did all this? Because your father never truly loved me. I was just part of the deal, the trophy wife who kept up appearances. So I decided that if I couldn't have love, I would have power. And was it worth it, all this suffering you caused?" Beatrice didn't answer. She just picked up the documents and began signing the transfers and waivers that Richard had prepared. 6 months later, life had changed completely. The company was clean, now focused on social projects and medical care for underserved communities. A way to compensate for years of embezzlement, Ricardo and the twins were publicly acknowledged as Anthony Mendez's children, taking positions in the company according to their abilities. Beatrice, fulfilling her part of the agreement, moved upstate, away from the spotlight and the power that had so corrupted her. Lucas was growing strong and healthy, his smile illuminating the house he now shared with Richard and Isadora. The girl, little by little, was going back to being a child, although her maturity and strength remained impressive. On a Sunday afternoon, the whole family was gathered in the garden of the house, no longer the old mansion, but a more welcoming house, full of life and love. Ricardo was playing with Lucas. The twins were talking to Isadora about their plans for college. They insisted on paying for her studies. And Richard watched everything with a full heart. He picked up Helena's rosary, which he always carried, with him and smiled. She was gone, but her last act of love, that hidden letter, had changed everything. It had transformed a story of lies and greed into a story of redemption and unity. "I was thinking," Isadora said, approaching him. "Mom always said that family isn't just blood. It's love, It's choice. It's being together even when things are difficult. Richard hugged the girl, who was now truly his daughter. The adoption had been officialized the week before. Your mother was a very wise woman, he replied. And wherever she is, I'm sure she's proud to see that her children finally have the family they deserve. Lucas, as if he understood that they were talking about him, let out a happy laugh that made everyone smile. He would never know the suffering that preceded his healing, the lies that almost cost him his life. He would only know the love, the unity, and the truth that were now the pillars of his family. Richard looked at the sky, thinking of his father, of Helena, of all the winding paths that had brought them there. Sometimes he thought everything has to fall apart so that it can be rebuilt in the right way. The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with golden hues. It was a new day, a new beginning, and this time everything was as it should be.